Recore is good, actually? Recore is a game that I regret not playing sooner. Maybe more than any other video game? Basically, what I assume it is more or less the phoenix risen from the ashes of the Mega Man Maverick Hunter first-person shooter that Armature and Keiji Inafune were working on back while the latter was still at Capcom. And ooh, boy howdy, does it have a lot of both Metroid Prime and Mega Man X DNA in it. For one thing, when you boot up the game and you start a new file, I swear, some of the UI and menu sound effects are just straight up Metroid Prime sound effects. I don't know if they got the same guy or if they are just maybe they're sound library samples that anyone can license. I don't know, but it resembles very closely those sound effects. Something that I had a problem with in Metroid Prime, which I recently replayed, was that towards the end of the game, most of the combat just boils down to fighting color-coded enemies with the weapon which matches them. And it might sound a little, sketchy at first when I say that Recore is basically about taking that concept from the last couple levels of Metroid Prime and fleshing it out and making it more streamlined so that it can be the core system for more or less an entire game. It takes a little while to get going before you have all of these guns, but once you do, pretty much the latter 2/3 or so of Recore is that sort of system. Now, they do a lot of things to make it a lot better. For one thing, the biggest problem I had with the color corresponding combat of the final areas of Metroid Prime was less to do with the color matching itself and more to do with the fission Metroid enemies, which were just kind of annoying because they split into multiple, and now you have to worry about your target. You have to worry about what weapon you're using, and especially if you're playing on the Wii, using the motion controls to switch weapons is a lot more cumbersome. And even if you're playing on the GameCube and can use the stick to do it, there's still a long animation that plays out as Samus's beam changes shape. In Recore, all of this is virtually instant. You press the button, color changes. That's all there is to it. In Metroid Prime, if you want to switch targets, you kind of have to do the 3D Zelda thing, right? You have to just kind of mash the lock-on button and hope that eventually you land on the right one. In Recore, you just flick the stick in the direction of the enemy that you want to switch to. It's that simple. Why don't more video games just have simple lock-ons like that? Dark Souls is maybe the only other game I can think of that has a lock-on like that. And then the buttons. The thing with Metroid Prime is that you have a rapid fire, a charge shot, a side dash, and a jump. And all four of those actions are only split across two buttons. You tap the A button to fire rapidly, you hold it down and then release to do a charge shot. The B button will normally jump, but if you're locked on and moving horizontally relative to the enemy, then you'll do a dash. In Recore, all of these actions are separate buttons, so there's way more precision in terms of not making mistakes in the heat of battle. And aside from the gameplay itself, the world is sort of where a lot of the Keiji Inafune seems to come in to me. And not just because it's robots, like in Mega Man. It's like even certain things about the art direction, I wonder how much he really had to do with it, because things like Pylon 512 and the E-Tower, they just kind of have that look to them that things like Model W or certain elements of the Mega Man 0 and X architecture had, It just has a similar vibe. Something about a big triangle with an eyeball in it. I know that that's kind of, that's pretty typical imagery, but the specific sort of sci-fi angle that you see with it seems very Mega Man. I guess if I had any complaints, my biggest one would probably be that when you dash and then jump, your momentum doesn't carry into it, which is something that Mega Man did ever since Mega Man X on the Super Nintendo. The sun is not being very reliable. Hopefully that's a bit better. I don't know how much of an improvement it's going to be, but it's something. It's at least more consistent than the sun. In addition to the aforementioned abilities carried over from Metroid Prime, you also have a death blow, similar, I guess, to something like Metal Gear Rising, you know, when an enemy is in a certain state, or you've snuck up on them, or they're low on HP, you can click in the right stick, and it's interesting. It's kind of like a fishing minigame. It takes a little getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, like, you'll be yanking out cores like no tomorrow. Not to mention the combo system, where every time that you deplete a segment of an enemy's health bar or kill like a small like insect enemy that doesn't have a health bar, it will add 1 point to your combo meter. And with the combo meter, whenever you get to 10 points, then you can click the right stick to instantly yank a core without having to do the minigame. And there's some really interesting stuff with the final level of the game where they really have you like play around with the mechanics in like surprisingly deep ways. Like there's a zone where basically the way that the game keeps you from going out of bounds is there's certain parts, you know, where there is geometry that you're not really supposed to go, where it'll do the battlefield thing, you know, where basically it starts depleting your health, you have X amount of seconds to get back into the normal play area. Well, in the final level, there are just spaces that are like that. When you use the death blow, though, you recover HP. So what they do is they have situations where, like, maybe there's a bunch of tiny insect enemies that you can just, you know, rapid fire, get your combo meter as high as you can, and just keep on instant extracting to make sure that you maintain your HP. Or there's another one where there's a limited number of landmine enemies that basically act as your health refills for the battle. It's really cool. Not to mention the whole thing with the E-Tower, the final dungeon of the game, its significance in the story is that it's basically for like terraforming this desert planet, and once you sort of start to make progress in it, when you go back out into the world, there's an area called Shifting Sands. It's one of the biggest hub areas in the game. And it has a dynamic weather system, and as you spend time there, the sands, as the name suggests, will shift and new areas will open up. It's really neat. The exploration in the game reminds me a lot of like something like Breath of the Wild, you know, like you even have like a glider and stuff. Kind of reminds me of Xenoblade X as well. That might just be because of like, you know, like the little loot drops scattered around the world. Not to mention, I guess, the tank is kind of analogous to when you finally get your robot in Xenoblade X as well. I guess another complaint that I have is, I guess it's not a super valid complaint, I just didn't realize for a long time that the icons on the map tell you what kind of dungeon each one is. If I had known how to tell them apart, I would have done a lot of the traversal dungeons a lot earlier than I did. Because, you know, usually I'd do kind of the Breath of the Wild thing, right? Where I would get my fast travel points at all of the shrines. You know, they're not shrines in ReCore, but like they're pretty functionally similar. I'd get my fast travel points, and then maybe in a different play session where I just wanted to knock them out, I'd go back and do a bunch of them. But if I had known how to tell which ones were platforming challenges, I would have done those a lot earlier, because I love this game's platforming system. Ultimately, it's my fault for just not, you know, really paying attention to what these icons meant. But the platforming is fun. I mean, it's no Bowser's Fury, it's not that complicated, but like, you know, you have a double jump, you have a couple dashes you can use, there's, you know, all kinds of like special platforms and, you know, gimmicks and things. Like, it is genuinely just like a solid 3D platformer. Combat, you know, it's tough but fair. It's got a good loop. There wasn't really any point in the game where I got stuck. I guess if there was anything, the final boss had like some moments where like I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. It's the final boss. It's supposed to be the toughest thing in the game. And the setting's really neat. It reminds me of like, this is a deep cut, but like Lego Mindstorm Stormrunner. It's like an ancient Flash game from the Lego website. That's what it reminds me of, just this barren planet with, this real industrial machinery. It's just so neat, like it's a good game. That's all there is to it.
All right. As much fun as it's been pulling your leg, it's time to get real. ReCore is a video game that I regret not playing sooner, but it is probably a very good thing that I did not. ReCore came out in 2016, but it may as well not have existed until it was released on Steam in 2018. On console, it has terrible load times and performance, and crashes even on the Xbox One X. It launched with missing content and features, and for the first 2 years, if you wanted to play it on PC, you had to jump through the hoops of the Windows Store. While I want to recommend ReCore to everyone, I can really only recommend playing it on PC through Steam using a controller. You should not play this game on Xbox. You should not play this game through the Windows Store, and even though the game's mouse and keyboard support is workable, it's really obviously not ideal. Because of the game's reputation, I felt compelled to try and figure out what exactly it is that people don't like about this game, and I think to a large degree, as far as the critical response of the game goes, most of the critics' problems with the game were solved with the definitive edition. It really seems to me like it's a problem of just too little, too late. They reviewed the game as it was when it came out, and it was more or less set in stone. The definitive edition doesn't even have a Metacritic score because so few critics went back to the game when the definitive edition came out. As far as sort of amateur reviewers, YouTubers, and things like that, the main thing that I notice is that a lot of people compare ReCore to other games.
Borderlands-y, sort of a Ratchet and Clank vibe.
But almost nobody seems to be viewing the game through the lens of the actual games that it's clearly influenced by, like Metroid Prime and Mega Man X. This is probably going to come across more condescending than I mean it to, but in a way I genuinely feel like the kinds of people that this game was available to and marketed to at launch were people who largely lacked the vocabulary to understand what this game was. Like, there's a lot of Metroid Prime DNA in this game. And if you're an Xbox fan, chances are you're not familiar with that, and you don't see how the mechanics from that game carry over into this one. And the same thing with Mega Man, The heyday of Mega Man platformers was before there even was such a thing as an Xbox. ReCore has a lot going on. It's a third-person character action looter-shooter open-world platformer, and I don't think I even covered everything in that description. Like, if you don't have at least the baseline of, oh, it's like 3D Mega Metroid, you're gonna be so lost. Like, a lot of the sort of confusion that people seem to have with this game is not even realizing that it's a collect-a-thon until the final area of the game, when they start to hit some of the bigger requirements for the collectibles. And like, that's the thing, is there's some legitimately ridiculous stuff in the way that the collect-a-thon element of the game is handled. Like, for example, the DLC area that was added in the definitive edition. In order to defeat the final boss, because of the way damage calculations work, the final boss of the game is actually above the game's level cap, and it's so far away from the level cap that you literally cannot damage the boss unless you are at the level cap, which you will not be unless you've done a pretty good job of exploring the whole game. And yet, getting into the DLC dungeons barely requires any of the collectibles at all. Like, I want to say you can get in with like 6 out of the 70 or so that were in the base game, more than 100 that are in the definitive edition, and beating the game only requires maybe 30 of them. I'm honestly not entirely sure, because I know, like, I've been watching other people's reviews and I've seen like videos of, you know, oh, it takes like 35, but I also know that they lowered the count after launch, so I think it's only like 25 or something now. And that's the thing, is like, even if you look at it as like, oh, it's a collectathon, I have to do optional shit, like, look at this fucking, look at Owlboy's video here.
The game shoves a hand in your face to stop you and says, you haven't completed the required number of optional objectives to continue to the next part, to which I would respond,
like, you barely need to do even a third of the optional content in the game in order to reach the end. And that's still too much. Any amount of friction at all keeping you from the credits is too much. The game just has to be over. I don't want a collectibles. I want to see the credits and be winner. Some people complain that the story is like weirdly serious for a game about a girl and her robot dog fighting against an evil Bionicle, but like, that's pretty much par for the course for a Keiji Inafune game. Mega Man Zero 2 is the only video game that I'm aware of that both has an E rating and contains the words concentration camp. Like, this is very much like what you should expect. A lot of people didn't like that the later dungeons expect you to use the mechanics in such advanced ways, but it's hard to take complaints like that seriously when it seems like so few people can even get the basics down. Like, there's achievements in the game for gliding for a set amount of time, which if you're exploring the overworld at all with the glider, you will get that achievement. It doesn't take much. And there's an achievement as well for digging 20 times, which is something that the main story of the game requires you to do several times. And those achievements for gliding and digging are about as rare as the achievements for reaching the final dungeon and beating the game. And then there's those additional areas of the game that you can only get to once you activate the weather system in Shifting Sands. So few people have found that content that pretty much all of my rarest achievements on Steam are from finding those levels.
I'm just hopping in for a quick second to say that while I was editing the video, I realized that I had some screen caps from a particular review that I meant to address and did not, which is someone was complaining that they would enter a dungeon and then they would need to backtrack in order to switch robots because they had the wrong ones. The doors literally tell you what robots you need, and when you go to the fast travel point at the beginning of the dungeon, which is where you switch robots, you can literally check the map, and on the map, the dungeon will have the icons on it, showing what robots you need. Like, this isn't like a puzzle that the game developers put in to waste your time and make you backtrack. This is just you not paying attention.
Aside from the few relatively minor issues that I had before, I think that the biggest issue by far is just sort of like certain elements of the game's surface level presentation. Like, the soundtrack is boring. They had some guy do it who mostly does like movie tie-in games or like old, I think he did a Medal of Honor game or something, you know, but it's all just like these bland cinematic swells, and then when combat happens, a lot of the time there's some, you know, there's like a rhythmic song with some unusual time signature to let you know things are getting tense, and then everything else is just, you know, those fucking superhero movie strings to let you know that what's happening is very important. And it's just the most boring shit ever. And like, looking at the other stuff that guy's worked on, it seems pretty clear to me that that was a Microsoft decision. Like, Metroid Prime has one of the best soundtracks of all time, and Mega Man's music, like, it doesn't even need to be said. Almost all of it's great. And yet, pretty much the only thing that I remember from ReCore's soundtrack is there's a combat theme that's just kind of like... I haven't played bass in a good while. I don't even know if the microphone's picking that up, but I just thought that'd be funny. And as much as I do love the setting, I really wish there was more variety. Like, there's never gonna be a sequel to this game because it did terrible. Armature doesn't even really make games, they just make VR toys now. And of course, Keiji Inafune's reputation has been pretty much completely tarnished at this point. But if there ever were, by some miracle, a sequel to ReCore, like, I genuinely think that the main difference, aside from the soundtrack and maybe some slight tweaks to the platforming, is more environmental variety, more biomes, you know, maybe like a rainforest, you know, and I understand thematically why they wouldn't have done that in this game, but still, it gets a little tiring looking at the same desert, you know, the whole time you're playing, pretty much. In conclusion, ReCore is probably the best game that Keiji Inafune has worked on since leaving Capcom. And I say this as someone who likes Gunvolt. ReCore is basically the only real video game that Armature has made. And that's a shame, because I'd like to see more. ReCore is probably the best Microsoft Studios game that isn't a 2D platformer or a racing game. You might have noticed any readers of my backlog that I added that there because Forza's more fun than I gave it credit for when I wrote the text review. ReCore is not good enough to be in my top 10 games of the decade, but if I did a top 50, it might be in the 30s or so. ReCore is not great. At one point, it probably wasn't even good. But it is now. And I'd say give it a chance. I went in fully expecting to hate it, and I was pleasantly surprised. Like, again, there's you gotta play it under certain conditions, but if you're willing to meet the game on its own terms, I think you can have a great time with it. Anyway, that is gonna be it for this one. So comment, favorite, subscribe, like, or even dislike. Just show that you care in the boxes down there. But seriously, I'll see you tomorrow.